Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to Introducing Test Cafe Studio presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. In this webinar, Paul and Julian will demonstrate the capabilities of our new end-to-end web testing IDE, Test Cafe Studio. They'll start by downloading and installing Test Cafe so you can see how easy it is to set it up. Once Test Cafe is installed, Paul and Julian will demonstrate how to record and edit a test using Test Cafe's integrated visual test recorder. You'll see that little to no coding knowledge is required to use Test Cafe, yet JavaScript code behind can be generated as the test definition. Finally, they'll run their tests in multiple browsers and on a remote device in parallel. Throughout the entire session, Paul and Julian will point out important differences between the new product and its predecessor, Test Cafe version 15.1. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later, and we will send the link to the recording in a follow-up email. We'll also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul and Julian.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Mr. Bucknell, you're here with me.
Absolutely. Yes, it's new, it's brand new, just been released, Test Cafe Studio. And what I'd like to do to begin with is talk a little bit about why Test Cafe Studio when we already have something called Test Cafe. So way back when, say 5-6 years ago, we released a product called Test Cafe. And Test Cafe was a product which enabled you to record tests for your web applications or websites and then be able to play them back and check that the results produced by those tests were what you expected. Assert a particular result. We released it. It was a good product, but we realized fairly early on that in essence, the problem with Test Cafe is that it's the engine that does all the hard work, and we needed to get that engine fine-tuned, get it much better, more resilient, shall we say. And so we decided to release the engine as an open source project on GitHub, and it's still there and we still use it. And we were hoping for a lot more people to use the open source version to see, to give us feedback on issues, what went right for them, what went wrong for them, and so on and so forth. And over the past, say 3 years or so, we've got a lot of feedback through that open source project. And we've refined Test Cafe Studio, Test Cafe, the engine part of it. And it's essentially a product for developers. You write your tests in JavaScript and then you can run those tests through Test Cafe. And I'd have to say it was a good experiment, and the engine now is one of the premier testing engines for web applications and websites. Now, having done that, we realized that not every tester, not every Q&A professional is a developer, and especially a JavaScript developer. I learned JavaScript, it took me 3-4 months to be fairly proficient in it. But your Q&A professional on your testing team there is not of the same job description as mine. So Test Cafe Studio we released, and it enables you to visually record steps that you're taking throughout a web application or a website, including a final assertion to say the result should be this. And you can record those, play them back. You can store them in what we call test fixtures, which are collections of tests, run a complete fixture. And as we'll see later on, you can also incorporate those into your continuous integration system or framework so that they can be run not necessarily on demand, but regularly or continuously. And the studio is there for your testing professional, your testers. And as you see here, Paul has just put up a slide. It's everything you'd expect from an IDE for testing.
I know that certainly when you mention test, Julian, some developers, UI testing or maybe unit testing, are going to crawl up into the fetal position under their desk. So it is important to focus on why web testing is critical to a good website. And that can be everything from browser compatibility, it could be direct functionality, could be regression testing for features across things. And of course, because web browsers are so unique in a sense to the different engines, Chromium versus what's behind Firefox and Safari, that there's a lot of compatibility style issues when people are designing websites. It could be something as simple as we're going to see today, maybe a 1 pixel difference in the way that the engine gets rendered. So having a good set of tools like Test Cafe Studio makes doing that job actually a delight.
And I've got to point out here, there are lots of different types of tests. And Test Cafe Studio is more geared towards what you might call functional testing. If the user enters this kind of information, clicks on these elements, this is the result of those actions. So it's more functional testing. We're not really talking about unit testing here, where the developer is writing function, he has to agree that if such and such an input goes in, this is the output, and you can write a test for that. That's unit testing. Or there's integration testing. Does it work with this particular backend and all that kind of stuff? No, we're more talking with Test Cafe Studio about functional testing. Does the app work and produce the results you expect it to produce?
Absolutely. Now, for those that have been using a previous version, so the last commercial version, version 15.1, the slide that we're showing, quick update on what is different. Key factors here, it is now a desktop application. It's not based in your web browser, and it uses a different engine, different technology, and which makes it faster, and as you'll see with some of the other features we've introduced. My favorites out of this list, you've been able to continue recording a test anytime down the track. So you record a test, you can edit it, and then you go, oh, I want to add some more steps to that. You can simply jump in and continue recording from where you left off. It was one of the most widely requested features of the previous version. The debugger, which I'm going to be showing off today, is absolutely amazing. Being able to do a edit continue style inside your web page while working with your test. The concurrent testing, the selectors that we're going to be stepping through, there's so many little aspects that make Test Cafe Studio really, really nice to work with. Before we install, let's talk quickly about how we can download it. So from the products page, which is at devexpress.com/products/testcafe, you can just use the download button. Now the browser is going to determine what operating system you're using and download the package for that. So in this case, we can see in the status bar, it wants to download a Windows version. However, if you're like me and you run multiple operating systems, you may want to download some of the other packages. Simply scroll to the bottom of the page and you can choose download for Windows, Mac OS, 32 or 64-bit versions of Linux. So it is a product that is truly cross-platform. If I jump into the slides, installation, Mac OS, once you've downloaded the DMG, just mount it and then drag Test Cafe Studio application over the top of the application shortcut there, and it will copy it and you're done. That simple. We do want to obviously call out that you need to read the EULA as well. If you're running it on Windows, download the executable and run it. You're then going to get the license agreement. The installation options are minimal, so basically just whether you want to install it for your single user or for all users. And after a few seconds, you're going to see the end screen saying it is ready to launch. And for anybody that's running Linux, just extract the zip file to wherever you want to keep your binaries, and you'll see the Test Cafe Studio binary there ready for you to run. Regardless of the process or the operating system you're going to install it on, it's a simple process for registration. If you're running the 30-day trial, simply click on the Start Your Free 30-Day Trial button and you'll be able to use the product for that period. If you're already a registered user, you can click on the Register Test Cafe Studio, enter your credentials for your DevExpress account, and then you'll see the registration complete. One thing I did want to quickly touch on, and that is the pricing model. If you're a universal subscriber, then you already have access to Test Cafe Studio. You can buy the product on its own. Now, Test Cafe Studio, with the community support, which is provided through the Stack Overflow channel and includes the 12 months worth of updates, is $249.99, and the Pro version includes the world-renowned DevExpress technical support at the $499 price mark. You can then see below that we've got the renewal prices under there at $99.99 and $199.99 respectively for the two different versions. As Julian pointed out, Test Cafe Studio utilizes the Test Cafe engine, which is available as part of our open source range on GitHub. So to use that in the API, there's no charge. What we charge for is the Studio version, which is where all the power comes in that we're going to be looking at today. So after you've installed and registered or gone through into the trial mode, you can simply launch the product. What we'll do here is then switch into Test Cafe. And we've got the opening page. So the welcome page will come up. You can choose to turn this off if you want. Simple menu structure, so File, Edit, View, Help. View allows you to jump into full screen and collapse or expand some of the panels, and then Help is a great way to jump to the documentation online as well as the all-important follow on Twitter. Next, we've got the toolbar, which has got open icon for the directory for the test fixtures and save. We've got the configuration or selection of which browser I want to choose for recording my test and some additional options, and then which configuration I want to run my tests. And I'll be going through these in a lot more detail soon. On the left-hand side, we have the Explorer panel, which is where my test fixtures are going to be kept. The right-hand side is the workspace, which is a tabbed environment, and that will change obviously depending on what we're seeing. A couple of quick options to record a new test or create a new fixture on the left, and then the all-important reports or results panel at the bottom. One thing you'll notice is inside the Explorer, it's based on different directories. So I can say open the test directory, and I can create one called webinar, and that will contain just the tests for that project. Once I'm inside the Explorer, I can right-click and I can create a new directory, call it whatever I want, and I could keep nesting those directories, create more at this top level. And at the same time, under that context menu, I've got the ability to create a new fixture, a new test script, or an arbitrary file. I can also rename any item that I'm selected on as well. Now, when it comes to a fixture, think of it as a collection of tests. So here we can see this recorded examples, which comes with the product, is a fixture, and it's made up of all these individual tests, which I can get to by clicking on the fixture itself here, or I can get to them inside the Explorer. So if I've got the Explorer tab minimized, I can still navigate around quite easily. The other thing that I find really useful is the ability to then show in Explorer. So quite often, particularly if we're looking at screenshots or other things, I can jump in. I'm not having to mess around thinking where on my hard drive did I put that file, if it's a network share or anything like that. So that's the anatomy of the Test Cafe Studio UI. The beauty here is it doesn't matter what operating system you're running on, you will get the same experience. So you can move between operating systems and you don't have to think, oh, well, is it somewhere different on Mac? Is it somewhere different on Linux? Anything I missed there, Julian?
No, I think you got the essentials covered pretty well, let's say. Notice, I just want to reinforce the fact that on that toolbar there are two browsers mentioned, or rather not quite two browsers mentioned. One is a recording browser. In other words, what browser are you going to use to record your tests? So we, Test Cafe Studios recognize that Paul has essentially 4 browsers available on that particular machine, in Firefox, Chrome, good old Internet Explorer, and Edge. Whereas the run configuration option there, although it has a name of Mozilla Firefox, that's just a name. We'll see in a moment, or Paul will show in a moment, the actual configuration behind that name. And we notice there's one called Julian's Set, just for a laugh. And so although those come with the product itself, you can name those run configurations whatever you like. The record browser is the name of the actual browser you're going to be using for recording.
Absolutely. I mentioned before that we've got this tabbed environment. So we can see here I've opened up my fixture for recorded examples. From here I can see the web page that it's going to be running to, which I can obviously click on as a hyperlink. And on the right hand side I've got the ability to record a new test because I'm not selected on any test right now. If I was to select a test and hit record, it would actually start recording test actions in an existing test, which is that powerful feature I mentioned. We've got the ability to create a new test from here, delete the entire test fixture, or convert it all to JavaScript. Now I can do that on the test fixture, or I can do that on an individual test itself. So it could be that I only want to convert one of my tests into JavaScript code. You'll notice when I come into the test itself, we've now got a panel. We'll go to webinar around. We've got this panel showing the tools available, and they're broken down into a number of different elements. So we've got assertions. Now assertions are where we can do pretty much a Boolean check to say, did something happen the way we wanted to? And think of it in terms of, for every positive assertion, we also have a negative. So equal, not equal, okay, not okay. There's the ability to look at contains versus types, greater than equal to, less than equal to, within, or a match. We've then got this collection of on-page actions. Now, it's important when you're working with a web page to consider that there may be instances where an action is required that Test Cafe cannot capture. And we're going to look at an example of that using hover, because Test Cafe is not going to try and record absolutely everything the mouse is doing, especially when you're moving it around. It would become too cumbersome, collect too much data. But with the on-page actions, we've got simple things like clicks, right clicks, we've got text typing, there's different key presses, there's drag and drop, there's the caret position, there's hover, introducing weights, and all sorts of things there. Whilst Test Cafe Studio has a powerful debug option, which we'll look at, you can also inject the debug option as an action into an individual test. So you could say, after those 4 elements actions have occurred, I then want it to switch to debug. And with that, the browser will pause and then let you continue at that point. So really handy for interacting. You can also introduce a speed test. I'll explain a little bit further on speed tests when we look at the run configuration. It's also important to note that sometimes you want to interact with your browser in a slightly different way. So, well, native dialogues, for example, they're going to be, if you've got a website that requires the user to upload a file or to select a file from their hard drive, anything that is a specific user action, you can then work with the browser actions. And that includes resizing, includes navigations, and the ability to take a screenshot. Now, screenshot is something that I think is an amazing feature. You can inject this anytime in your test. So when the test's running, we want it to take a screenshot. Here I've got the screenshot element. We can see I can just drag and drop those actions anywhere in the test, and I can nominate a specific path for that screenshot, which I'm not going to do. I'm going to use the default that was set up in my test fixture, or sorry, my run configuration. Underneath that, we've got switch frames. So if you're working with a website that has iframes and parent frames, you can again put that action in to switch between those frames. And then down here, we've got two important little icons. One is define an element selector, which Julian will go through a little later, and also define a function, which I will give you an example of. So this is the layout of an actual test in visual mode or in Test Cafe Studio's own file format. If I wanted to convert this to JavaScript, a simple click on the JS icon, it's going to give me a default name. And I can do an individual test, or I can come up here just to show you how quick it works and call this Julian.js.
You're still doing a single item there.
I am too, sorry. There we go.
There we go.
And Julian and create. And straight away, I've now got all those tests as JavaScript tests. Whilst we've got this panel up, I want to highlight a couple of things here, again, because it's so cool. This is the Test Cafe editor or text editor, and it has full syntax highlighting, syntax coloring. It's got the ability for me to jump straight in and execute a test from the toolbar here. We've got the mini viewer on the right hand side, which makes it easy to navigate, especially since most tests, real world tests, are going to be quite lengthy. We can see it is just straight JavaScript. It's got the import statement here. So selector is the imperative one when you're using Test Cafe in JavaScript. We could add as much other JavaScript as we wanted to. You will notice if I start typing, it's got context sensitive help, as well as the ability of a really feature rich set of options. So I can jump in, use my context menu, and then see all sorts of other items, including a powerful command palette exposing a lot of the functionality that's available there. We did mention that once you've converted a set of tests into JavaScript, you can't switch it back to the visual recorded tests. And that's because I could come in here and I could, I don't know, Julian's going to shoot me for this, but just put in...
Oh, okay, yeah.
Just put in some code, hello mum, and of course that's not something that Test Cafe Studio is going to know what to do with or how to do it. So it can't really switch it back to that set of visual tests.
It is important to stress this, I would say. When you're doing a visual recording of a test, as again, we're targeting this more towards the Q&A professional rather than a developer, say. When you record that visual test or visually record that test, we're going to store it in our own format within Test Cafe Studio. So that's why there is this option to, if you really, really want to do this, you can convert it into JavaScript and then modify the JavaScript to your heart's content to a certain extent. However, there's no way we could then parse that JavaScript back into our own internal format. As Paul said, you could be adding stuff to that JavaScript that Test Cafe Studio knows nothing about. You could be importing other libraries, for example, to do some extra features within the test, and so on and so forth. My biggest recommendation is, and we recommend it ourselves, is do not alter the DOM. Otherwise, you may make a change that Test Cafe Studio is not able to detect. Test Cafe Studio essentially presents the DOM to you, if you're a JavaScript developer, as a read-only entity. So read it to your heart's content in your JavaScript or TypeScript, but yeah, don't alter it. Just use it to, create the environment for a particular assertion you're about to make. So yeah, just be warned. Yes, it's a visual recorder, but once you convert it to JavaScript, it's going to be a JavaScript code file, essentially. And only your developer will know how to change it and how to fix it and all that.
Now let's jump in and take a look at the run configuration. We'll execute some of these example tests before we go through and create our own samples. Julian pointed out earlier, this is a configuration list. It's not necessarily specifying the browser you're going to use. I can control what's in this list by clicking on the icon, and we're going to get the Run Configuration panel. I can create a new configuration, as I did earlier with Julian's set. I might call this one Paul's set.
Paul's set. There
you go. Within here, I can choose the browsers that I want the test to execute against. So I can say Firefox and Chrome. I could choose these others if I wanted. And then there's also this headless mode. Now with the headless mode, it effectively means the tests are going to run inside a browser in a non-visual instance, which means that the test can be executed more quickly. However, you need to then work through and decide whether all your tests will work in that environment. So you've got the trade-off between the increased performance, but not all tests will work in a headless mode. So something you need to test. The other option here is the remote browser, which I'll turn on into my set, and how many instances of a remote browser I want. When this is in play, Test Cafe Studio will generate a QR code and a unique URL that is displayed when the tests get executed. You can then just scan this on a mobile device or use the URL into another machine, whether it be mobile, another desktop, laptop, doesn't matter. The point is Test Cafe Studio doesn't need to be installed on that machine, and you can still do the testing on that remote browser, including things like the debug. Now, one thing that I will note doesn't work on the remote machine is the screenshot. Everything else will be captured. You'll just get a blank image, basically, if you've got a screenshot in there. Underneath the browser selections, we've got the review, fails, and debug. So here I can say, if any console error occurs, then I want you to fail that test. And so that might be a good one to have on, depending on what's happening in some of the JavaScript you're running on your page. We can have it automatically take a screenshot if a test fails. So whilst I can take screenshots anywhere inside my test actions, here I can say take a screenshot if my test does fail. So that's handy. We've got debug mode, which we'll come back to, quarantine mode, and pause when the test fails, which effectively is similar to debug mode, but it's jumping into that break point only when a test fails. And then under here, we've got our advanced options. We can specify the reports path for this configuration set, the screenshot path. We can set the default timeout for selectors and the assertions. Test Cafe, as we're going to see, has got a really nice way of waiting to see if the elements you're looking for are loaded into the DOM before it will fail a test saying it's not available. So you can create or set those timeouts here. You can also control the speed in which your tests are run. Basically 0.01 is the slowest all the way up to 1, which is the optimal or the fastest speed that you may want to set. As an action point, you can also slow tests down at different parts of your web page. So it could be, yay, everything's running really well. Oh, during this particular set of features, we need to slow the test down and then speed it up again. So this is the default for the test. You can alter the speed during the test. And then the concurrency option. I want to point out that Test Cafe is not built to do stress testing or load testing on websites. There's no point putting 10,000 concurrency and hoping that it's going to test your web API or your web page for 1,000 concurrent users. That's not what it's built for. Concurrency is there to allow you to run a large number of tests more efficiently. So if I was to set the concurrency to 2 and I'd got 100 tests, it's effectively going to try and run 50 tests in each instance of each browser that I've selected. So in this case, it would just be Firefox. And I can hit apply there or OK. Obviously, I can rename the configurations. I can remove configurations as I need to. It might be that you have, as we've got here, a set that tests everything on all browsers and only runs optimally, doesn't do screenshots, doesn't quit. The other thing I want to point out is the default report view. So you can nominate here how you want the report to be shown when the test is finished, be it passed or failed. Now this list is built automatically again by Test Cafe, based on what you have selected or what reporting libraries you've got imported. Julian, did you want to mention about the libraries?
Essentially, what we've designed is an API for reporting your tests, and all of those options you saw there are the default report add-ins, if you like, that we ship as part of Test Cafe Studio. There is a much larger list, and Paul is showing you this. It's on the NPM site, basically. There are a vast number. There's 55, did it say up there? Obviously, the half dozen or so that we ship as part of Test Cafe Studio is there. But you want to report via Slacker, then there is an add-in for that. Essentially, it's npm install -g or -g, whatever the name of the reporter is, and Test Cafe Studio, when it starts up, will recognize the global installs of those reporter add-ins and add them to that list. The other one I just want to quickly talk about is quarantine mode, which glossed over earlier. Essentially, if a test fails, it could be just it failed. If you turn on quarantine mode, what will happen is it'll actually run the test several times and see how, or rather the largest proportion of those tests, whether they fail or pass, and that's what quarantine mode is all about. It'll just keep rerunning the tests, and if the majority of tests or the majority of runs fail, then it's counted as a fail for that particular test. If the majority actually pass but some fail, then it's counted as a pass, just about. Anyway,
cool.
It can be handy in certain situations, let's put it like that.
I apologize for my glossiness.
That's how I view you, Paul. Glossy.
Executing a set of tests. We can run the tests by clicking on the play button on the actual fixture, or we can run individual tests. Now, the other thing we can do is using the control key, we could come through and execute just selected tests, and that feature works across multiple fixtures. So it could be that you just want to pick half a dozen tests across half a dozen fixtures, or that would need one test per fixture, but you could do that and then run just those. Well, let's actually see what happens when I run all of my recorded examples. I will pre-warn everybody that we have noticed with GoToWebinar, sometimes we get some strange things happening with our browser. So if you see me restart Test Cafe Studio, it's because of that.
So Test Cafe Studio has loaded up the browser. It's now talking to the browser. It's going to load up the web page, and it's going to start interacting with that web page. That big mouse cursor is Test Cafe's mouse cursor, not Paul's. And so it's running through the various tests, and it's eventually going to get there, and it's done. Oh, we have passed 9 of those tests and 1 failed.
Absolutely, which is good. I'm happy with that. So I can jump to the actual results of the test by clicking on the link there. And we can see that because I'm looking at it in a grid, I've got a nice, easy to use UI. The grid itself features some obvious functionality, such as I can sort my passed and failed tests. I could sort by an actual fixture, or I could sort by any of the columns I can search. We can see here that I've actually got the screenshots included in some tests. So we've got this one here. I get the actual screenshot as to what was happening at the time, and we noticed earlier that I don't have a previewer app on my machine, which is interesting because I use a virtual machine. But if you click on the button, it will open your default viewing app and show you that screenshot. It's saved as a PNG file in that reports directory that you can get to. What we are interested in here is the fact that we've got this one failure. I can expand this, and it's going to show me the browser was Firefox. The assertion, it was expecting a value of 352, and it got 353. So I've got the ability of jumping straight into that action. It's going to show me the error that occurred during that action, and even visually, so if I collapse that, we can see that we know the action had the error. At this point, we already know through trial and error that this is due to different resolutions, different retina screens, and we're talking about a pixel. So it's a great opportunity to either change my assertion. I could do a contains or a greater than and then add another assertion for a less than if I know that there's going to be literally pixel differences between these values. I could also look and maybe use a different element when it comes to that test. But just for now, I'm going to change that to 352, and I only want to run this test again. And this time we should see a complete success on that test. What I did there by clicking on the action was expose the properties that are available for each action. So if we start to look through what's involved inside a test, and then we'll record some of our own. We could see that the click action, all items are going to require a selector of some type. Now the CSS selector is usually the easiest one, and when we record this, I'll show you how powerful that can be. But we also have a function selector and element selector. The function selector itself is what you would use if you're wanting to work with data contained within a page. And a great example of that would be, well, let's go in and create a new function. So this one I'm going to call, I don't know, get page URL. And what I want it to return is actually window, and here you can see just the power of that editor, which is, even in this instance, working with a small edit window, it's got that nice IntelliSense, which is going to make my life as a developer a lot easier. And I want to return href. So effectively, this is going to just do that. It's going to return the page URL, and I can use that inside an assertion. So now if I was to add an assertion underneath this, I could choose that function. Oops. And I could break everything. I can actually select function and then pick my get page URL and enter the value that I'm expecting. So this could be HTTPS, whatever it is that I want. And that would then allow my assertion to determine whether that function value is correct or not. So I can switch between the DOM, or I can select any of the functions that I've built in my element there. That makes sense, Julian?
Absolutely. The point about this is sometimes identifying a particular element of your HTML DOM is really easy. You've got an element with a CSS ID, and that's like that very first one there where you're saying click, and we're going to click on tried test cafe. Or there's going to be, I mean, obviously the nice thing would be is every element had its own name, but that's just impossible. When you're designing your web page, or when you're using, say, one of our control sets of DevExtreme, for example, you know, you're stuck with whatever the application is going to name elements, or it's not going to name elements at all. So there has to be a way for Test Cafe Studio to identify a particular element in the DOM, even though it doesn't have, say, a CSS ID. And so there are an awful lot of ways that Test Cafe Studio will try and identify a particular element. And so the function ability there is, please return something that I can test. You know, maybe it's an element name, maybe, as Paul showed you there, it's the URL of the page because we switched pages. and so on and so forth. Or Test Cafe Studio will try and identify an element through various ways. And obviously the first one here that Paul is showing is the ID of Try Test Cafe, but there's another one. Maybe you start at the main form and we try and find something underneath that particular element that has a name of Try Test Cafe, and so on and so forth. Or maybe there's a label. It has the text, I have tried Test Cafe. We try to find that other element underneath. There are lots of different ways that Test Cafe Studio could identify an element. Or if your Q&A person is good or your developer is good, you can actually write your own selector. And Test Cafe will store the selector and then under a particular name, a unique name, and then apply that. Maybe you're looking at, the third child of this second child of this element, or so on and so forth. Oh, in fact, Paul has created an element selector there, and we can use that instead. So there's essentially, if you think about it, if the user is interacting with your web page, is interacting with some element on that web page. Is he clicking on it? Is he entering data into it? Is he hovering over it? You have to be able to allow Test Cafe Studio to identify that particular element so it can run the test again.
One of the benefits of defining the element selector is that obviously it makes it a lot quicker just to reselect or re-choose. I want to use the word select again here, Gillian, to pick from that list quicker than using the CSS selector every time, especially when it gets more complicated. And now I'm going to record our own set of fixtures. So I'm going to create a new fixture. I'm going to call it Julian.
Yeah, I'm your Q&A professional.
You've used that a few times. So you like that, don't you? Q&A professional.
Yeah.
So we're going to use one of the DevExpress demo pages as our go-to. We can see that that's now created this fixture and it's added a new test, which I could rename test 1, and I'm ready to go. At this point, I'm going to choose the record test action. But before we do that, let's just jump in. We already talked about the fact that I can choose the browser I want to select that with, and we then have some record options, which again really is the speed, the timeout that I want my assertions to be worked on, and or selectors. Hit record. We're going to see the browser open. We're going to see the Test Cafe engine fire up and load the website that I nominated. What I want you to focus on here as I go through and select some things is what's happening in the background inside Test Cafe Studio. We can see the page has been loaded, and to start with I'm going to come through and I'm going to say that I want to appear. So I've clicked and you'll see the elements of Test Cafe registering the fact that I clicked. 350 tab, 550 tab, and click. We jump back into Test Cafe Studio and we can see all of those items now applied in that sense. At this point it's still recording, so I could switch back to the browser, and here what we're going to do is hover over support, come down to news groups and click. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. We can see that everything's happened, but there's something here that I want to highlight. Let's clear my panel for a second, and now I'm going to run those tests. So to run that simple test, it's going to again spin up. I'm sitting just in Firefox My Replay. Page loads. We can see at the bottom of the screen, once the page loads, the status panel from Test Cafe Studio. And this is also cool because you get to see when it's waiting for elements. You can see all those things happening there. Applied the changes, waiting for element to appear. It's waiting for that news group element. Waiting, and test is going to fail now because it never appeared. Why is that? back to the example I used earlier of hover. So we know that the element didn't appear, and we know that there's a problem between these two things. Right now, I could go in and manually add a hover, do that sort of stuff. What I'm going to do is remove the last action, and I'm going to press record again. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there's an edit continue or a continue recording from. So what Test Cafe Studio is going to now do is run my test. It's going to get me to that point all the way through, and you can see it moving in the background there, apply changes, and it's now waiting for me. Whilst it's recording my browser actions, I'm going to jump into Studio. I'm going to click on hover. Now the CSS selector, I don't know what it is, and so I'm going to use the ever important picker. So with this little icon, I can pick a target element. It's going to switch me back to the browser, and then as I hover over everything, it's going to show what the elements are. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to select the support element because that's what caused that hover to appear. That's now there. It's done the selector. I'm going to switch back to the browser, and now I'm going to click on News Group. When I go back to the studio, we can see that it's got my click and my hover. Stop that, and whilst I haven't added any assertions, I just want to see that it gets all the way through to there and thinks it is working, because it's a great example of how we can inject specific on-page actions into our tests in those scenarios that aren't just straightforward of click, click, click. So here we're expecting the page to load again. It's going to go through, apply those changes, wait for the page reload, support, and we have 100% test.
It's important to note that you don't have to have an assertion. Maybe you're, as Paul is doing here, you're developing a test, so you're requiring not only the visual way of recording it, but you're going to be doing, oh yeah, I need a hover here, I need to do that, I need to do that. And it's good to actually be able to, go through a test, see where it stops, where it maybe fails because it doesn't recognize something that's happened, and then be able to correct that test. And then finally, at the end, presumably there is some kind of assertion that you have to work out and type in to say, well, this element has to have value 7 or 42 or whatever it happens to be.
The number of the universe.
Yeah.
So what I've just done there is jumped into my configuration, and I've now activated a remote browser. The last thing I want to show you is how the remote browser actually works. Now when I start running my tests, it's still going to spin up Firefox for the local test, but we're going to see the QR code or the unique URL that I could then use a mobile device or an external machine to actually run that set of tests as well. Obviously, capturing one screen with GoToWebinar, you can't see me holding my phone up right now, but I'm testing the actual steps as we go. So it is pretty cool. And as Julian said, that the remote functionality has been a key part of Test Cafe since inception. And I was thinking about it earlier today. We were having a chat. I still remember the meeting, the design meeting, where the team first raised the idea of a testing framework for web browsers.
And I would also point out that if you're watching this on YouTube, that URL doesn't work anymore.
Of course. Support ticket. The URL doesn't work. No. Now, we've been through, we've looked at existing tests. We've talked about converting tests to JavaScript. We've shown you how simple it is to start recording your own tests inside test fixtures, how you can change the multiple configurations, how custom on-page actions can be inserted. We've looked at specific user-defined functions, element selectors. One of the frequently asked questions that we also get is, this is all great, but how do I then incorporate it into my CI pipeline, or more continuous integration pipeline? Because once somebody's gone through and created this whole suite of tests, you then want those tests to run as part of that workflow. What I'm going to do here is jump over to the documentation. So docs.devexpress.com/testcafestudio is a great place to start. Lots of information here, including some tutorial videos, guides, everything. What we're really interested in right now is this integrate tests with CI systems. We've got documentation set up straight away for all of these elements. So for example, if you're a Azure DevOps user or one of my favorite Jenkins, you can jump in here and go through and see the steps required to integrate that with your CI pipeline. Again, lots of NPMs, but it's a visual step guide to incorporate Test Cafe's results or tests directly into your pipeline, which is really, really powerful, especially in the enterprise level or with more and more people switching to that larger workflow. Now, I did just receive a ping. I did not show you one feature which I promised to. So what I'm going to do is run our test again. This time, I'll take off my remote browser and I want to put on debug mode. So thank you for the kick in the pants there, Julian.
It was all done by ESP, darling.
Colorado to Brisbane. So the debug mode is a really, really clever, cool, important feature. Turn it on and run my test. Again, we're going to see the engine spin up. It's going to show us the web page. And we're going to restart Test Cafe Studio. So this is one of the things I pointed out at the top of the presentation, that when we're capturing the screen, sometimes we get some quirky things happening between all the screen recording and what's going on in the task manager or the processes. So here's one I created earlier. Here's my test one. And let's run it. Just make sure my debug is still on. Yes. Away we go. Of course, anything that goes wrong from this point of the webinar, I can now blame Julian, since he was the one that said, hey, we're going to step through this.
So what's going to happen here is Test Cafe loads up the browser, loads up that web page, starts the test, and stops at the very first action.
We can see that we've got this panel down here showing that we're in debugging mode. It's got the ability to unlock and therefore work with elements on the page, or I can choose resume, which will continue the test without any further interaction, or I can go next action. So as I step into here, we're going to see each of those steps and we're going to see the result of what's going on, which is really, I think, a great feature when you're wanting to deep dive into a set of complex actions inside your test. You can step through, you can be looking at different things that are going on. And of course, I did mention that you can inject the debug action specifically into a test as well. So you could have a test that's a few hundred actions long and say, well, at step 30, I need to check something, I want to do something. So it is a powerful, powerful feature. We can step through, and at every stage, I can then just say, resume. One other thing, since we've just talked about that little banner that's showing down the bottom of the page, when you're recording your Test Cafe visual test like this, you've got the banner sitting along the bottom anyway. But what I did want to point out is, whilst you can see at the bottom of the screen, it says I'm working on Julian Test, the version of the browser and the operating system. That's showing me that I'm recording, which is good because I know that something else is happening. But if I move my mouse down over here, it gets out of the way. So if I'm wanting to interact with something that's right at the bottom of the page, it's not being obstructive, which again, I think is a great little feature when you're considering what's going on in the background. Did I miss anything else, Julian?
Nope, I think you covered pretty much everything.
Excellent. So what we might do now is switch over to the questions, and let's take a look at what the team have been answering in the background.
Okay, I'm just as much in the dark as you are, so let me just open the right panel here in okay. Hang on a minute.
And we have to say thank you for the team for being on the presentation and going through answering things as we do.
So the first one is Test Cafe available only for web apps, or is it also available for WinForm apps? And the answer to that is it is just web to web. We are Test Cafe Studio is loading up a browser and going to a particular URL and then either recording a test for that URL or playing back a test through that URL. So it's just web-to-web testing. Does Test Cafe Studio, here we go, work well with React as far as selectors go? And the answer to that is...
Well, the question really around that, Julian, is obviously React reuses selectors in a unique way. So does Test Cafe Studio work well with React?
So the problem with React is it kind of reuses selectors all over the place. But it's a nice little black box library, if you like. And we're basically, in the future, we're going to be creating a plugin for Test Cafe and React so that it'll work a lot better with React apps. Yet again, this shows that we're taking to heart the whole open source infrastructure of GitHub, if you like, and Node and NPM and all the rest of it, to be able to create plugins for Test Cafe Studio to not only do things, as we were talking earlier, about continuous integration or a different way of reporting on your tests and all the rest of it, but also these things like, we ought to have a plugin for React so that we can record tests better with React apps and so on and so forth.
Which is a long way around saying, yes, it does actually work with React, but you may have to modify your selectors if they fail. There's no specific functionality for React support in Studio, but you can tweak those selectors or put some of those other attributes around them. So one question was, can you run the old version 15.1 style JavaScript features or fixtures in Test Cafe Studio out of the box? Yes, you can run version 15.1 tests directly from Studio. Do we have any direct support for browser stack integration? And not at this stage. You want the next one?
It's Cucumber. What? This is a new one on me. This is one of those jokes of, it's a new day, there's a new JavaScript library out there. I can't say I've ever heard of Cucumber, but there we go. We are currently using Test Cafe together with Cucumber. We need to do additional setup to make it work. Do you guys have Cucumber integration with Test Cafe on a roadmap or Test Cafe Studio? So it's on the roadmap. And for the open source version for the engine itself. And then once that's done, we'll consider adding it to Test Cafe Studio. So obviously, if it's not there for the engine, then it's not going to be there for Test Cafe Studio because Test Cafe Studio is using the engine underneath the hood. Hey, this is getting to be a right car metaphor.
Now, the multi-user question, I don't have an answer to yet, so I'm going to refer that one to the team. The question was, how many users can be using one test project? I'm going to come back to that one. And licensing, if you have DevExpress Universal, yes, you already have access to Test Cafe Studio.
Yep.
And yes, of course, the YouTube channel will have this presentation as well. That's it, Julian. We're at time.
Okay. Magic. Amanda. Are you still there?
I am. Hello. All right, like I mentioned before and like Paul mentioned before, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box. You will also get a follow-up email with a link to this webinar recording sometime next week, so keep an eye out for that. Also, Launch 19.1 webinars are now posted on the website starting May 13th. You can go to devexpress.com/webinars to register for those now. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Julian and Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.